Hey, now look, one other important point needs to be made before we really drill down into where this relationship between the United States and Europe is headed. Look, I said at the top, our friends, our allies needed some tough love. They needed a kick in the rear end. They are our friends, and they are our allies. And I don't want that to get lost in this entire discussion. I don't want that to get lost this week. Look, these member countries in NATO, they have not been paying their fair share. But like a family member, like a friend who's gone astray and needs a kick, they're still our friend. Let's discuss this further. Very happy to be joined by Professor Michael Desch with the University of Notre Dame. Michael, thank you for joining me. It was a fairly rambunctious, raucous day. Give me your take on what happened today.
Well, the president was true to script. He had put down a couple of markers about what he thought were the key issues, and he played on them, and then also threw a curveball at the Germans by bringing in the Nord Stream pipeline and German, Russian, fossil fuel and gas trade.
Why, in your estimation, Michael, why did he bring in that curveball at Germany right at the get-go today?
Well, I mean, Germany and Angela Merkel, really are the other potential pole of power in Europe. And, I think if you're going to push the Europeans around, you're going to push the biggest dog in the park around, and that's Germany. I have to say, I have a different take on the whole Nord Stream thing. I'm sorry that the president insinuated that the Germans are somehow dependent on Russian gas. I mean, that's just not true. I think the Russians are more dependent on German euros or Deutschmarks because, they need to sell gas and oil. That's about all they've got. But, the real point that is underneath that is that, the Germans have, I think, a more nuanced view of Putin's Russia than you would get from sort of the public rhetoric. I mean, on the one hand, Merkel and the German political establishment are not happy with Putin's activities, particularly in Ukraine, which is, sort of close to Germany. But on the other hand, they're happy to do business with the Russians, and the gas trade is all about good old Adam Smith. Terms of trade are favorable for that, and the Germans are happy to criticize Putin, but also happy to buy his gas.
Well, and on that point, Professor, where would Germany go to get their gas if not Russia? Why not us, but why not themselves or anywhere else in Europe? It seems like much of Europe is so dependent upon Russia right now.
Yeah, that's the wrong way to think about gas and oil. Gas and oil exists in a global market, in one big bathtub. And you can get oil from Venezuela, you can get oil from Nigeria, you can get it from the Persian Gulf, or you can get it from the tar sands in Canada. And so it's a bit of a, sort of a red herring. They buy Russian gas because it's close by, so it's relatively speaking cheaper and more convenient to buy Russian gas than to ship it in from outside. But if the Russians turned off the spigot, I don't think the Germans would even notice it. So, it's a canard. But what it does indicate to me is that, despite all this breathless talk about, how the president is potentially selling NATO down the road, by giving them a hard time about their low defense spending, that in fact, most of the Europeans do not see Putin's Russia as the second coming of the Soviet Union. They have a much more nuanced and a much more variegated view of the threat. Now, if you're in the Baltic states and you're living right next door to the bear, your hair's probably on fire. But if you're in Germany or France or Italy, you have a more relaxed view, I think.
So, Professor, where is this relationship now when it comes to NATO with us and the other member countries? The president laid down a pretty heavy stick today. What do you see happening? How's this going to play out?
Well, nobody is going to spend 4% of GDP on defense. We don't even do that. No. So that's a non-starter. The Europeans have a long track record of promising to do more and then never doing it. So, safe money is on that we're going to be talking about European burden sharing every year for, the next 20 years. I think the bigger issue is, do the Europeans start thinking seriously about how seriously they view the threat from Russia? And if they're more alarmed about it than I think they are, then they're going to start spending more money. And they're also going to explore maybe additional or supplementary security arrangements. The European Union, for example, has a military committee, and there's been talk over the years of them taking on a bigger role in terms of managing the post-Cold War European security architecture. And frankly, I don't think that would necessarily be a bad thing. I think a lot of the trouble we're in today is because after the end of the Cold War, we just kept expanding NATO east, despite the fact that many Russians, including a lot of Russian Democrats, told us that this was not going to be good for Russian democracy. In fact, the first wave of NATO expansion is 1999. Guess when Vladimir Putin jumps onto the political scene in Moscow? Right after that. And four waves of NATO expansion since then have only, solidified his power and reinforced the sort of ugly Eurasian nationalist side of Russian politics.
Professor Michael Desch, thank you, my friend. I appreciate it very much. Another horrible example of media bias. I'll have it for you next.